Now, rather than you ask another personal question, perhaps why don't we ask Rachel and Tim a personal question? Does that sound? Because quite often we're a bit selfish when we engage our spirit friends, and we want to know a bit more about them. So, are there things you'd like to share, Tim and Rachel, or shall I ask the questions?
You know that we are not shy. We are happy to share with you, and we feel so strongly. We are very happy to share about our life here in the spirit world, or the lives that we led on earth. But we feel the most joy that we have is being, and this is what we say to Miriam often, is simply allowing our presence to be felt here with others. This feels such a great way that we wish to share. We wish to share this love that we have, and this encouragement that we wish to give to each of you in this very, very worthwhile endeavour that you are attempting to undertake, that you are taking your first steps on. And so for us, this is a lovely way to share, to be able to be present with you and to hopefully convey some of that deep regard we have for each of you. For we know you have many choices in life, and to choose this path is not always easy.
So how would you describe your personality? Because there's people in the room who can't feel your personality, so how would you describe it?
We are a soul who is very, for both Tim and I, in our lives on earth, we felt strongly drawn towards God and towards service. And this is perhaps two of the divine, some of the strongest traits in our personality that defined our life on earth and continue to define us here in the spirit world. We have a strong feeling for God and desire to know God and to be known by God. But also we are not yet in the union state, and so I'm speaking of us as two, although often we do forget ourselves and recognise that we are one. But this desire to serve has been something that we did, both of us, on earth, and have continued to do in the spirit world. We helped you, brother, and Miriam very much to assist people in lower realms in the spirit world. And also when this opportunity arrived to become guides for Miriam, we felt deeply honoured. But it was very fitting that God would desire this for us, because our desire for service is such a strong one. We feel we feel quite alive when we are able to assist others, especially in their relationship with God, and to come to know the very big possibilities that are available in this relationship with God. In fact, our nature is quite similar to some of the qualities that Mary displayed in her early life, in this life. We both have enjoyed travelling on earth, but also in the spirit world. We spent much time exploring. After we became at one with God, we spent much time exploring. We were fascinated by, for example, the many different worlds that are, and different realities almost, that people in the 6 dimensions are attempting to create. And the very many different ways different groups within the 2nd and 3rd spheres choose to interpret their religious faith. We spent much time exploring these things and interacting with these people. We have a feeling of joy when we come to meet different people and to see them and understand why they do certain things. So this is why it was also chosen for us to to be quite suitable for Miriam again in her early earth life when she reincarnated, because many of these things were within her, the family that she chose to return to, and it made it easy for us to connect with her and to guide her in ways that would eventually lead her to this realization of who she is.
And Miriam mentioned earlier that you were in the 10th sphere. Is that actually true?
It is perhaps her underplaying our conditions.
Correct, yes. So that's a little filter of Mary's there.
Yes, this is a... Again, don't be laughing at me. Yes, Miriam often receives the more accurate message first, which she chooses to question. We are, in fact, in the 13th sphere, between the 12th and 13th sphere.
And you lived on earth, obviously, at the time of the 1st century after Jesus and Mary.
Yes, we knew them. We knew you during this time, and for Tim, he was more closely associated with yourself, as you know, and after my passing, which happened not long after your passing, not even a year after your passing, I passed, and I understand that Miriam has shared that in the last couple of days about how that occurred. But Tim went on to spend much time teaching divine truth on earth until his
So is he the Timothy of the Bible that Paul wrote to?
Yes. 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 We knew each other in our time on earth, and we had a brief love. But circumstances and the culture of the time meant that we did not pursue this. I felt strongly that my role was to be with Miriam. I wished to serve, and the injuries surrounding the we did not give much regard to this soulmate relationship. And so while Tim and I met briefly and felt a deep love for each other in the brief months that we knew each other, we both felt that we had different roles that we needed to fulfill. His was in teaching divine truth, in sharing that on the earth, and I felt strongly that my way of assisting the way to continue was to be by Miriam's side. And so we parted without much thought for our own personal happiness. This is something that both of us have had to work through since our passing. This injury, while our soul has a strong feeling for service, there was the injury within both of us to deny ourselves in favour of service. Now we have a much more loving viewpoint of what it is to serve, and consequently much happier. And this brought us together much more quickly after Timothy's passing. I had already begun to work through this injury as I entered, some years after I entered the spirit world. Tim joined me much later, 30 years later, and at that time he still was needing to work through that injury, and I was able to assist him with that. And after this happened, we were able to prioritise our love much more firmly, and we progressed. As you know, this relationship between soulmates is a wonderful way to encourage the progression of the total soul, because one half pulls upon the other, and as you come into closer rapport again, the desires that are more open perhaps in one half of the soul than in the other begin another tug forward, and this has happened for us quite beautifully throughout our progression.
And many probably on earth don't understand this aspect of, once you honour the love in your relationship, that actually causes you to be able to have more ability to fulfil your design, if you like, or God's design for you. Yeah.
Yes, and isn't this a wonderful truth? And perhaps we need to give you an entire message on this one beautiful truth at some time in the future, because it is very true. And both Timothy and I remember the feeling of receiving this truth from God, that when we honour the love for our soul above service, above really the opposite, above denying ourselves in favour of others, there was much more energy and much more ability to serve. So much more ability to fulfill that passion that we had once we healed the injuries surrounding it, and once we honoured the love between the two halves of ourself. Yeah. It is.
I see that in our audience. There's a lot of that same sort of focus where there's desire to help others before they help themselves.
Yes.
And that is obviously going to severely restrict how you can help others.
It certainly does. Even the most, what we perceived as the most pure desire that we had on earth, to further the way, this most profound thing that changed us so profoundly. For myself, I was born with a deformity in the first century, and my dear brother Jesus healed that for me. And so that my faith and desire to share the truth about God and the way with others was so strong, and I believed that this was such a pure desire to serve others. And yet it led to quite a lot of pain and separation from myself and from my soulmate. And it wasn't until I passed that I came to understand how important this was. To purify, this service was not really a pure desire, even though I thought it was the most pure thing that I had ever desired. And while it was a wonderful desire, until I really purified it in terms of love and let go of the injury within it, it wasn't until then that I began to see the true power of that desire in action. And Tim and I have had an amazing life in the interim between then and now, serving and teaching the way, but in a way that did not cause more pain and suffering or separation between ourselves.
And did you receive counsel from Jesus and Mary about the fact that you were separating yourselves just to fulfill what was sort of almost an addictive part of your desire?
Certainly both of them spoke to us strongly about this. But as many of you would be accustomed to, we did not necessarily pay a great deal of attention to what they said.
Because it's something that Jesus and Mary felt quite strongly about, wasn't it?
Yes.
Whenever a soulmate couple met, to honour the love that they had between each other.
They spoke about this on and on, in fact. And to be very honest, at that time for most of us, it was as if they were speaking almost in a different language to talk about the honouring of the love between men and women, and not to honour the contract of the marriage between men and women. And many of us could not understand really what they meant. And it wasn't until really some time after my passing when I felt the devastation of what I had done in choosing to go or both Timothy and I choosing to separate, and the fact that even then I had passed, and this would mean a long separation from him until he passed, that we began to see that it wasn't necessarily about the marriage contract that our culture honoured, but this love that I felt more intensely after my passing even, that we began to see what they were trying to teach us.
And that would, for the sake of the audience, that would have been similar with most of the people back then that were listening to Jesus at the time?
Yes, yes. Many of them were fascinated by the truths about God and fascinated by you personally, because you displayed such love and such compassion and such faith that people had not experienced before, because we saw it in the way that you lived and acted and were willing to confront people in our society that we would never be willing to confront. So many of us were just fascinated by this, and of course we felt your love also. But many of the teachings that you gave, we did not really begin to really consider and think about more personally what they really meant to us, and what this issue of love and the relationship between men and women. Many of us had no concept of why that would be even pertinent to a relationship with God. And for the majority of us who knew you in that time, it wasn't until after our passing that we began to look more closely at the incredible breadth of the teachings that you had given us. Most of us in our time on earth simply focused on the love of God and telling people about the love of God.
Well, I think Miriam's starting to get a bit tired now, so I'll let her have her rest. Thank you very much, Rachael and Tim, for coming.
Thank you all for your... If we may leave you simply with some words of encouragement. Do not forget this very first part of the message that we gave to you, which is to simply begin to become aware of who it is you are right now, because this knowledge will empower you to make changes. And coming to know yourself and then desiring to share that with God, just as you are right now, this will form the basis of the changes that you are able to make in the coming year. And we have already made the date to come and speak with you again next year. We see a great deal of potential in many of you, in fact. And we see that this week has been time well spent, especially for a certain few of you. And so we encourage you as you leave here, because there will be all of your fears that are still unresolved and all of those addictions that are still in play in your life. There will be many spirits who will wish to come and to lead you away from dealing with those things. So if you can remember in the next few weeks that this is likely to occur, and to remind yourself of the truths that you have learned, and some of you have begun to even feel some of these truths in the past week. If you are able to keep these things in mind, and to simply pray to know yourselves well and to know your will well, so that once you know it well, you might begin to change it in a real way, in an emotional way. We see there is great potential, and we truly thank you for this opportunity to come and speak with you this afternoon.
Thanks very much. G'day. How you all doing? Good? We'll probably have a bit of a break now. What's the time? 4:30? In fact, you probably have expended most of your energy for doing mediumship today, haven't you?
For mediumship,
Yeah,
probably. Thank you, guys. I'm a bit scared. But it went okay. Yeah. Yeah, she's a very lovely lady, my guide. Yeah, very special. Yeah. Yeah.
And sorry for those who missed out on their personal questions, but I could feel Mary tiring, and I just wanted the opportunity at the end for you to get to know Rachael and Tim's life a bit, so you can feel a bit more connection with them, you know. Like, a lot of times we hear a lot of things from our spirit friends, but you know, we don't get to connect to their life and what their life was like, and therefore sometimes we think that that's sort of where they are now is so far removed from our personal experience. And the reason why I asked some of those more personal questions was because you can see that their personal experience was such that they did create a lot of their own unhappiness through their choices. And this is why Rachel and Tim were so concerned about saying to you about really focusing on your desires and focusing on your choices. You know, what choices are you going to make? Because you can make, even after you leave here, you can make choices that are negative or positive. It's going to really depend on how you exercise your will and how much faith you have about the positive choices to where you're going to go. And as you can see in their life, sometimes, you know, they were given advice and given counsel to do certain things, but of course they felt their own priorities were better placed in a different direction, as we often do, right? When it's our own life, we think, oh, that's, you know, that sounds well and good for everyone else, but for me, you know, I think I'll do this instead, and not understanding the full impact. And sometimes we don't understand the full impact until we've lived out our life and realised that it's something we chose 30 years ago we're still dealing with today. So in Rachel's case, her desire to basically save Mary from a certain type of outcome, sort of, and her feeling that that was her way of serving, caused her to detune from this love of soulmate, which is so she was still connected with the love of God, but it caused her to detune from this love of soulmate. And when that happened, she made choices, and so did Timothy make choices, which meant that they'd be separated for 30 or 40 years longer than what they needed to be. Does that make sense?
And then they only discovered that when they came back together, they could serve even better, and it was far more powerful.
And then, of course, you imagine once they've discovered that, they felt the pain that the whole 40 years that they spent apart wasn't even necessary. And this is what we often do with our poor decisions, is that we make a decision in a certain direction thinking that it's the better decision, generally against advice from more loving people, your guides, for example, or sometimes we've given advice, and we often go against that advice, thinking that we know better for our life at times, and then in the end, 30 or 40 years later, I only discover that all of that pain that was created as a result of that decision or choice was almost completely unnecessary. And this is one of the things I wanted to illustrate to you through our questioning of Rachel and Tim, in that they had as many failings as yourselves. They made choices that caused their own pain, you know, just like you do at times. And this is why they are so focused on trying to help you make decisions in harmony with love and truth, and wanting you to connect with your real desires. And in particular, some of the advice they gave, wanting you to connect with you as you are right now, because that will help you see what, you know, where the desires are lacking even. Does that make sense? And where the problems reside. And in other words, let yourself see if you desire to have a carefree life without your soulmate. You know, let yourself see that's what you really, really, really want at this point in time, rather than going, oh, I do want my soulmate. You know, let yourself see why you want it. Let yourself feel why you want it. Let yourself feel what, you know, emotional injuries cause you to want that and things like that. And when you do that, you'll find that you'll make less choices and decisions that cause your own pain and unhappiness. Does that make sense? So, and I think there are many of our friends in the first century who we could bring to have a chat, who could illustrate to you some of the choices that they made while they were on earth, and how those choices, against all reason and logic and also against love, caused so much pain and suffering in their later life, only to then have years and years later realise that they could have made a different choice right back at a certain point. Does that make sense? And the pain of regret that we have a tendency to experience, particularly most people after they pass in the spirit world, they generally have a lot of pain of regret. And what we would like to encourage you to do is to avoid that by feeling who you are right now, working through these addictions and issues, and connecting with your desires and passions, and then honouring them. Don't let your fear take you away from them. Don't let your fear of other people take you away from them. Don't let your fear of, you know, the false beliefs you have about God, your fear of God, take you away from them even, because God wants you to engage them, not go away from them. And don't let your fears of what's going to happen to you if you do that take you away from them. Don't let your fear of things like being controlled or manipulated or attacked or any other of those kind of fears take you away from your desires, because if you do that, you will end up making choices and decisions that sometimes 100 years later you come to regret, and then you feel like the 100 years was wasted. Does that make sense? And the beauty is you don't need to waste time like that. None of us need to waste time like that. It gets back down to our choices as to why we waste time like that. There's this common New Age philosophy is, I needed to go through that in order to, and then fill in the blank, None of that is really true. We don't need to go through all of these really negative things to come to terms with it, because we can choose right now to recognise love, recognise desire, recognise passion, recognise where we are, and we can do that now. We don't have to wait until some terrible event occurs to force us into that position. We don't have to engage one addiction and forsake all of our desires to engage one of those addictions. We're far better off, doing this in a more pure manner, and the more you can engage that individually, you'll find the less pain and suffering you'll have in your future progress. You'll find you'll have less worries and concerns. And also, when you pass in the spirit world, you will have no regret. No regret. If you asked almost any spirit who's passed into the second sphere what is their biggest emotion, most of the time the biggest emotion in the second sphere is regret. And the reason why is because they realise they could have made a different choice at so many times in their life, and yet they made the choice that finished up harming their life further. And when you're in the second sphere, you're coming to an emotional acknowledgement of all the truth of your life. And so, of course, in the second sphere, a lot of spirits feel that terrible emotion of regret. And what I'm suggesting to you is you don't need to feel the emotion of regret much at all if you're willing to go through these, learn these basic principles about desire, love, truth, will, faith, and really focus your attention on those. Don't go into the sort of listening to people who are in a darker space than yourself. Don't go into the devil's advocate roles, and don't go into the roles of condescension, again, of having an idealistic viewpoint of life. Don't condemn yourself for that. Allow yourself to engage your faith along those lines, and what will happen is you'll finish up having a life with hardly any regrets. Yeah. And when you pass in the spirit world, you won't feel regret, and so you won't spend years having to come to terms with what happened, because you've already come to terms with everything that happened. Yeah. That's probably, there's many of our friends in the first century who didn't listen to that kind of counsel and advice, who would love to come and talk to you about, what happened, what counsel and advice they received, and what they chose to do instead, and then what they saw as the consequence of what they chose to do that was out of harmony with the loving pathway they could have taken.
Rachel and Tim often give me that counsel, like that just one decision, you've got a decision ahead of you, like which way you're going to go, because it can alter the course of your life. And sometimes I think even in coming to feel about who I am and our relationship, sometimes it's been one decision where I've just chosen finally humility, or I've chosen to reach out instead of keep pushing you away, or whatever it was, that's really gotten me to this point even.
And then the happiness that comes
yes.
from the reversal of these poor decisions that we often take because we've been basically conditioned and almost brainwashed by our society and our upbringing into taking these course of actions. And just one choice and you reverse things, and then you start experiencing the joy, and then you realise, wow, I could have reversed this 5 years ago or 10 years ago, because I had there are certain events in your life that happen where somebody tried to make you conscious of that particular thing. Yesterday I was having a conversation with Caroline about her relationship with her husband, and she's going through stuff now about getting removed from her church, and the irony of it all is that almost 15 years ago her husband said that he didn't want to get involved as he is now in the church, and she wanted him to. And if she had just listened to her husband at that time, she wouldn't now be dealing with the fact that he is involved in the church and she doesn't want to be. Does that make sense? So it's just like these kind of things happen very regularly, where years and years later we realise, wow, we just pushed somebody or we pushed ourselves into a certain course of action because of an addiction, only to find out years and years later that it was just an addiction, that we were unwilling to feel a certain emotion. And if we had been willing to feel that emotion, we wouldn't be paying for the results of it today, right? Because remember, the pain that we're feeling is a lot about the compensation that we're paying for the previous choices we made, most of the time which we made out of harmony with love or in harmony with our addictions. And so this is why Rachael and Tim are very, very hot on this aspect of pursuing desire in harmony with love. Never give up your desires for any other reason that they are not loving. You see the statement that I just made? So never give up a desire unless you notice or know for sure that the desire is not loving. Then of course you need to give up that desire, right? But any desire that you know is loving, you need to pursue with all of your effort. You need to put aside many other things and pursue that thing with all of your effort, because it will help you understand yourself. It will help you make decisions in harmony with love. It will help you bring yourself in harmony with truth. It will help so many things. And then later, you'll look back and you go, I'm so glad I made that decision. So glad that I made that choice then, because... we see many, we've spoken to many tens of thousands of people, right, over the last 10 years. And we see many of them making choices, just one little choice, that is going to lead them down a path of a lot of pain, and potentially a lot of pain for hundreds of years, just because they couldn't accept one piece of advice or one piece of counsel. You don't want to do that, really. You want to be very careful about doing that, because your life is just, as a lovely statement in one of the Robert James Lee's books, that just everything turns on a diamond point. That's sometimes it's just the tiniest of choices that you make that lead to another choice, that leads to another choice, leads to another choice. Just the tiniest choice that you made in an addiction leads you to another choice with a bigger addiction, and so forth. And before you know it, 25 years have passed. And then you realise, all this pain has been caused by that process of making choice after choice after choice out of harmony with desire based in or founded or as a foundation of love, driving the desire. So we'd like to just encourage you to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, well...
Do you want...
Sorry, babe.